The air in the restaurant was thick with the scent of expensive saffron and the hushed, nervous energy of people who knew they were in the presence of a predator. Nala adjusted the silk strap of her apron, her movements practiced and fluid, yet her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. At the table in front of her, Daniel was talking. He always talked when he was nervous, a rapid-fire stream of local politics and business logistics that served as a paper-thin shield against his own insecurities. He reached across the table, his fingers squeezing Nala's hand with a possessiveness that felt more like a shackle than an endearment. "Don't look at him," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking slightly. Nala froze. The command was enough to break the trance of her obedience. Slowly, defying the gravity of her marriage, she lifted her gaze. He sat in the far corner, a silhouette of sharp lines and tailored charcoal wool. Joon-Woo Park didn't belong in the warmth of this room. He looked like a shard of ice dropped into a glass of red wine. He wasn't eating. He wasn't looking at the menu. He was simply sitting there, one hand resting on the table, his fingers long and still. When their eyes met, the noise of the restaurant, the clinking of silver, the hum of the air conditioner, Daniel's frantic breathing, simply vanished. Joon-Woo's eyes were dark, unreadable, and terrifyingly focused. It wasn't the way a man looks at a beautiful woman. It was the way a man looks at something he has already decided to own. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just watched her, stripping away the layers of the good wife until he found the hungry, hollow girl beneath. "Nala, are you listening?" Daniel's grip tightened, his wedding ring cold against her skin. "I said we should leave. Now!" Nala didn't move. A heat she couldn't name began to crawl up her spine. For years, she had been a ghost in her own life, invisible to the man sitting across from her. But this stranger, this man who breathed danger like oxygen, saw her. He saw the fire she had tried to douse and the freedom she was too afraid to ask for. She should have looked away. She should have reassured Daniel and gathered her things. Instead, Nala took a slow, steady breath, her lips parting just enough to betray her pulse. She didn't look down. For the first time in 24 years, she let someone look back. The ride home was a suffocating exercise in silence, broken only by the rhythmic click of Daniel's turn signal. Nala watched the city lights of Abuja blur against the window, her reflection a pale, ghostly shimmer that felt more real than the woman sitting in the passenger seat. Beside her, Daniel gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, a silent accusation she was expected to apologize for. The Okoye home was a testament to Daniel's success, marble floors that polished the soul out of a room, and glass walls that offered no privacy. It was a beautiful cage, meticulously curated to reflect the man he wanted the world to see. "You were distracted tonight," Daniel said, finally breaking the quiet as they stepped into the foyer. He didn't look at her. He began the nightly ritual of unbuttoning his cuffs, his movements sharp. "It's embarrassing, Nala. People in my circle notice when a wife's mind is wandering." "I was just tired, Daniel," she lied, her voice soft, practiced in its neutrality. He stopped, turning to look at her with a patronizing tilt of his head. He stepped into her space, not to embrace her, but to adjust the stray curl that had escaped her hair tie. His touch was clinical. "Tired. Always tired. Perhaps if you spent less time scribbling in those notebooks and more time focusing on the dinner committee, you wouldn't feel so drained. That catering business dream of yours, it's charming, really. But let's be realistic. You have a role here. You have a name to uphold." He said it like he was protecting her from herself, a subtle blade wrapped in velvet. To Daniel, her ambitions were mere hobbies, small distractions to be tolerated until they became inconvenient. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a centerpiece. Nala felt the familiar weight of his expectations settling over her shoulders like lead. She looked at his expensive watch, then at the wedding ring that felt heavier than it had an hour ago. For years, she had mistaken this control for safety. She had told herself that being the good wife was enough. But as she stood in the center of her perfect, silent kitchen, the image of the man from the restaurant burned in her mind. Joon-Woo hadn't said a word, yet he had acknowledged the woman Daniel worked so hard to erase. "Go to bed," Daniel said, dismissing her with a light pat on the cheek that felt like a seal on a document. "Tomorrow is a big day for me. I need you sharp." Nala watched him walk away, his footsteps echoing on the cold marble. She remained in the dark, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter, wondering when the cage had become so small that she could no longer breathe. The restaurant was louder than usual, a cacophony of clinking crystal and the forced laughter of Abuja's elite, but to Nala, it felt like a vacuum. She moved through the tables with the phantom weight of Daniel's morning lecture still pressing against her chest. Focus, Nala. Be the centerpiece. She had spent the last 8 hours convincing herself that the man from the previous night had been a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in her own sanity. Then the air changed. It wasn't a sound that alerted her, but a sudden heavy stillness that rippled outward from the entrance. Nala didn't have to look up to know he was there. The temperature seemed to drop, the frantic energy of the room grounding itself in the wake of a man who moved like a storm held in a bottle. Joon-Woo Park didn't wait to be seated. He walked toward the same corner table as if he had already bought the floor it sat upon. He was in midnight blue today, a suit so dark it looked like a bruise against the warm amber lighting of the bistro. Nala's hands shook as she reached for a water carafe. She tried to steer her path toward the kitchen, to hide in the steam and the noise, but her feet betrayed her. She found herself standing at the edge of his table, the scent of expensive tobacco and something metallic, like rain on asphalt, filling her senses. He didn't look up at first. He reached out, his long, scarred fingers adjusting the linen napkin with terrifying precision. Nala felt her pulse jumping in her throat, a frantic rhythm that he surely could hear in the silence between them. "Water, sir?" she whispered, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. Finally, Joon-Woo lifted his head. His eyes were darker than she remembered, stripped of any pretense. There was no judgment in them, only an observation so intense it felt like a touch. He didn't look at her uniform, or the wedding ring that caught the light as she poured. He looked at the tightness in her jaw, the way her shoulders were braced for a blow that wasn't coming. He leaned forward slightly, the movement slow and deliberate. The world narrowed until there was only the space between his lips and her ear. "You are suffocating in here," he said. 5 words. They weren't a question, they were a diagnosis. Nala fumbled the carafe, the glass clinking sharply against the rim of his cup. She expected anger, or perhaps the cold dismissiveness she got from Daniel when she failed at her role. Instead, Joon-Woo simply watched her, his expression unreadable but his gaze never wavering. He had seen the invisible bars of her cage and named them. She turned and fled toward the kitchen, her skin humming as if she'd been struck by lightning. She worked the rest of her shift in a trance, but no matter how many dishes she carried or smiles she faked, those 5 words echoed in the hollow spaces of her heart, louder than any vow she had ever made. The morning air in Abuja was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the distant hum of the city waking up. Nala stepped onto the porch to retrieve the morning paper, her movements robotic, her mind still echoing with the low, resonant vibration of Joon-Woo's voice from the night before.
"You are suffocating in here." She had tried to bury the words under the mundane chores of a good wife, but they had taken root in her chest, growing like weeds through the cracks of her composure. She looked down, but it wasn't the newspaper waiting for her. Resting on the stone step was a small parcel, wrapped in heavy, cream-colored paper. There was no mailing label, no courier's mark, and no signature. Nala's breath hitched as she knelt, her fingers trembling as she peeled back the wrapping. Inside was a weathered, leather-bound copy of The Famished Road.
A gasp escaped her lips, quickly stifled by a hand over her mouth. It was the exact edition she had lost years ago, the one she had mentioned in a passing, wistful comment to a coworker, while Joon-Woo had been sitting 3 tables away, seemingly absorbed in his whiskey. It was a book about spirits, about the struggle between the world of the living and the pull of the ethereal. A story she had once told Daniel she loved, only for him to call it childish folklore. Tucked between the pages was a single, dried spider lily. Its crimson petals were brittle, preserved in a state of frozen elegance, smelling faintly of old paper and something metallic, the same scent that had clung to Joon-Woo's suit. There was no note. He didn't need one. The book was an acknowledgement. The flower was a mark. He wasn't just watching her. He was listening to the parts of her that had been silent for years. The sound of Daniel's footsteps approaching the front door galvanized her into motion. The panic was instantaneous, sharp, and cold. She knew with terrifying certainty that Daniel would not see a book. He would see a threat. He would see a crack in the wall of his fortress. With a frantic grace, Nala shoved the book beneath the folded fabric of her linen tunic, pressing it against her skin. The cool leather felt like a secret heartbeat against her ribs. She straightened her posture just as the door swung open. "Nala, what's taking so long?" Daniel asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in her flushed face. "Nothing," she said, her voice steadying through sheer force of will. "Just enjoying the air." As she brushed past him into the house, the weight of the book felt like a promise. For the first time, she had something that was entirely hers, a piece of herself returned by a man who was supposed to be a stranger. The rain began as a rhythmic drumming against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the living room, blurring the manicured gardens of their estate into a smear of gray and green. Nala stood by the window, her fingers ghosting over the silk of her tunic, where the book was hidden in her room upstairs. She wasn't looking at the storm. She was looking at the reflection of the iron gates, wondering if a black sedan was idling just out of sight. Her mind was 1,000 miles away, drifting toward a pair of dark eyes that saw through walls. "The tea is getting cold, Nala." The voice was low, cutting through her reverie like a dull blade. Nala jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't heard Daniel enter the room. He was sitting on the leather sofa, a tablet in his lap, but his eyes weren't on the screen. They were fixed on her, narrow and calculating. "I'm sorry," she murmured, moving toward the silver tray on the marble coffee table. "I was just watching the rain." "You've been watching the rain for 20 minutes, Daniel said. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. But the cadence was sharp, a soft-spoken interrogation disguised as concern. "You've been distant, ever since that dinner. You're physically here, but your mind is elsewhere. Who are you looking for out there?" Nala felt the blood drain from her face. She reached for the teapot, her hand trembling just enough for the porcelain to clink against the cup. "I'm not looking for anyone, Daniel. It's just been a long week at the restaurant." "The restaurant," he repeated, the word tasting bitter. He stood up, walking toward her with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He stopped inches from her,
his presence crowding her space, smelling of expensive cologne and sterile office air. He reached out, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his thumb lingering a second too long against her temple. "I don't like the way people look at you there, especially that man, the Korean. I saw how he watched you, and I saw how you didn't look away." "He was just a customer," Nala whispered, her eyes fixed on the knot of Daniel's silk tie. Daniel's hand moved from her temple to her chin, tilting her face up until she was forced to meet his gaze. His eyes weren't searching for love. They were searching for a breach in contract. "Is he? Because you look like a woman keeping a secret, Nala. And you know I don't like secrets. They're messy. They're inconvenient." He squeezed her chin, not enough to bruise, but enough to remind her of the cage. "Tell me the truth. Has he spoken to you?" The 5 words Joon-Woo had whispered burned in her mind, a brand of fire on her soul. "You are suffocating in here." "No," Nala lied, the word feeling like a stone in her mouth. Daniel stared at her for a long beat, his expression unreadable. Finally, he let go, a thin, chilling smile touching his lips. "Good. Because you belong here, Nala. With me. Don't forget what happens to things that wander off." He walked away, leaving her shivering in the climate-controlled air. The porcelain cup sat forgotten, cold and cracked, just like the peace she had spent years trying to maintain. The sky over Abuja finally surrendered, collapsing into a torrential downpour that turned the asphalt into a rushing river. Nala stood on the shoulder of the darkened road, the hood of her sedan propped open like a broken wing. The engine had given up with a hollow metallic wheeze, leaving her stranded in the gray blur of the storm. She was drenched, her thin blouse clinging to her skin, her breath coming in ragged plumes of white as the cold began to seep into her bones. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom, twin spears of white light that grew larger and more blinding until a heavy black vehicle glided to a halt a few feet away. It was a silhouette of absolute power, the engine purring with a predatory low-frequency hum that she felt in the soles of her feet. The door opened. Joon-Woo stepped out. He didn't hurry. He moved with a terrifying calm, a man who had mastered the rain as easily as he had mastered everything else. He opened a large black umbrella, the mechanism snapping shut with a crisp, expensive sound. Nala braced herself, expecting him to command her, to usher her into the car with the same suffocating authority Daniel used. Instead, he stopped 3 paces away. He didn't reach for her arm. He didn't even speak. He simply held the umbrella over her, creating a dry, silent sanctuary in the middle of the chaos. The sound of the rain hitting the fabric above them was a dull, rhythmic thrum. In the shadows of the umbrella, his face was a map of sharp angles and starlight. He looked at her wet hair, the shivering of her shoulders, and the raw fear in her eyes. But he remained as still as a statue. He was giving her the one thing Daniel never had, a choice. The passenger door of the sedan stood open, a warm, leather-scented invitation into a world that would surely destroy the life she knew. Behind her lay the broken car and the path back to the golden cage where a husband waited to count her minutes. In front of her was the man who had seen her suffocation and offered her a breath of air. "I can take you home," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to steady her heart. "Or I can take you away. You decide, Nala." He didn't move an inch closer. He just held the umbrella, his hand steady, waiting for her to bridge the distance. The rain screamed around them, But in the small circle of his protection, Nala realized that for the first time in her life, the door wasn't locked from the outside. The interior of the sedan was a sensory vacuum, smelling of cedarwood and the faint ozone tang of the storm they had left behind. Joon-Woo didn't take her home, and Nala didn't ask him to. They stopped before a nondescript concrete building tucked away in a quiet corner of Maitama. There were no signs, only a heavy steel door and a security detail that melted into the shadows the moment Joon-Woo's shadow fell across the pavement. Inside, the space opened into a cavernous, minimalist gallery. Stark white walls held canvases that looked like wounds, slashes of deep crimson and jagged blacks. The lighting was surgical, cold, and precise. "This is mine," Joon-Woo said, his voice echoing against the polished concrete. "A place for things that are beautiful because they are violent." Nala walked toward a painting of a fractured landscape. "Why show me this?" "Because your husband's world is built on the lie of safety," he said, stepping up behind her. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his body was a physical weight. "Daniel buys you silk to hide the fact that he is small. He gives you a cage and calls it a home. My world is different. It is built on blood, debt, and the absolute clarity of what a man is willing to do to keep what is his." He moved to stand in front of her, his dark eyes reflecting the harsh gallery lights. "I am not a good man, Nala. I have done things that would make you pray for a God you don't believe in. I don't offer peace. I don't offer a good life." Nala looked at him, really looked at him. In Daniel's eyes, she saw a reflection of who he wanted her to be. In Joon-Woo's eyes, she saw the truth of who he was. He was a monster, but he was a monster who didn't wear a mask. There was a terrifying magnetic purity in that. Daniel's goodness was a weapon used to diminish her. Joon-Woo's darkness was a mirror that acknowledged her own hidden depths. "You're honest," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow.
"Honesty is the only luxury I can afford," he replied. He finally reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw, with a touch so light it was almost a question. "Now you know. There is no gold on these bars, Nala. Only the truth. Is that enough for you?" Nala didn't pull away. The danger was a live wire between them, sparking with every breath. For the first time, she wasn't being protected. She was being challenged. The silence of the house was different tonight. It wasn't the calm of a home, but the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a landslide. Nala entered the bedroom to find Daniel standing by her vanity. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the leather-bound copy of The Famished Road resting on the mahogany surface. Beside it sat the dried spider lily, its crimson petals looking like a splash of blood against the wood. "Where did this come from?" Daniel's voice was unnervingly soft. Nala's heart seized. "It's just an old book, Daniel. I found it at a shop near the restaurant." He turned then, and the look in his eyes made Nala stumble back. It wasn't the look of a man who had been betrayed. It was the look of a man who had found a flaw in his favorite possession. He picked up the book, his thumb tracing the worn leather with a sneer. "You're lying. You don't have the spine to go looking for things on your own. This was given to you. By him." "Daniel, please." "I gave you everything," he suddenly roared, the sound shattering the curated peace of the room. "I gave you a name. I gave you this life. And you bring this filth into my house? A gift from a criminal? A man who looks at you like you're meat?" Before Nala could breathe, Daniel gripped the book by its spine. With a violent, white-knuckled jerk, he ripped the cover from the binding. The sound of tearing paper was like a bone snapping. He didn't stop. He began shredding the pages, the poetry and spirits of her childhood fluttering to the floor in jagged, useless scraps. Then, his eyes fixed on the spider lily. He snatched the delicate flower and crushed it in his fist, grinding the brittle petals into the carpet with the heel of his shoe. "There," he panted, his face flushed and sweating. "It's gone. You're staying home tomorrow. No more restaurant. No more dreams. You will remember who you belong to." Nala looked at the wreckage on the floor, the ghost of the woman she used to be, scattered like ash. Something inside her didn't just break. It evaporated. The fear that usually kept her silent was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She looked up at the man she had spent years trying to please and saw him for exactly what he was, a small man holding a handful of dust. The good wife mask didn't just slip. It shattered, leaving her face as unreadable and dangerous as the man in the charcoal suit. "I don't belong to you," she said, her voice a calm, lethal edge. "And you just destroyed the last reason I had to stay." The gala was a sea of shimmering silk and false smiles, held in a ballroom that smelled of lilies and desperation. Nala stood at the edge of the crowd, her body draped in a gown Daniel had chosen to signal his ownership. But her spirit was already miles away. She felt Daniel's hand on her lower back, his fingers digging into her skin through the fabric. A silent warning, a tether he refused to slacken. Then, the room shifted. The orbit of the evening rearranged itself as Joon-Woo Park entered. He didn't need an invitation. He was the gravity the room had been waiting for. Fueled by a cocktail of scotch and wounded pride, Daniel didn't wait. He marched toward the corner where Joon-Woo stood, dragging Nala along like a prize he was afraid to lose. The music seemed to dim as they approached. Joon-Woo was flanked by two shadows in suits, but he dismissed them with a flick of his wrist. He didn't look at Daniel. He looked at Nala, his eyes tracing the faint, tense lines around her mouth. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face here," Daniel spat, his voice loud enough to turn heads. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, attempting to occupy the space Joon-Woo naturally commanded. "Nala is my wife, my house, my name, my life. You think a few books and some cheap stares change that? She's mine. Stay away from what belongs to me." The silence that followed was absolute. Joon-Woo didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon or raise his voice. He simply took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving Daniel's sweating, frantic face. The contrast was devastating. A man trying to claim a kingdom he was losing versus a man who already ruled one. "You speak of her like she is a trophy on your shelf," Joon-Woo said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through Daniel's bravado. "A thing to be polished and put away when it becomes inconvenient." He stepped closer, entering Daniel's personal space with a coldness that made the air turn to ice. He leaned in, his words intended only for the three of them. "She is not a trophy, Daniel. She is a fire you've spent years trying to extinguish because you're afraid of the heat." Joon-Woo's eyes flickered to Nala, a flash of something ancient and protective burning in the dark. "And the tragedy is, you're so busy guarding the cage that you haven't realized the bird is already gone. You aren't winning. You are already losing her." Daniel's hand dropped from Nala's back, as if he'd been burned. He looked at his wife, searching for the submissive ghost he knew, but found only a woman looking at the man in the charcoal suit with the terrifying recognition of an equal.